The Wyoming Territory, 1876. The air that met Clara Dawson as she stepped from the stifling carriage of the train was so thin it felt sharp in her lungs, a blade of cold crystal. It smelled of dust and distance, of pine needles baked by a sun that seemed closer here, and of an immense, waiting silence. Before her, the town of Laramie was a raw collection of plank and log buildings huddled against the vast, rolling plains that stretched to a horizon of bruised purple mountains. This was the edge of the world, and she had come to it to be married to a name. A man she had never seen, whose life was contained in 3 spare letters written in a blunt, angular hand. He had sent the train fare and a single instruction: "Look for a man with a gray hat and a wagon. That will be me. Captain Turner." She saw him at once. He was leaning against a freight wagon, separate from the small clutch of men waiting for cargo or kin. He was not a tall man, but broad in the shoulders, built of the same unyielding material as the land itself. His face was weathered into lines of watchfulness, his eyes the pale, washed-out blue of the winter sky, and they missed nothing. They found her, a small woman in a worn brown traveling dress, and held her for a moment. In that gaze she felt herself measured and weighed, and the familiar cold shame washed over her. She knew what he saw: a woman of 29 years, her face too thin, her mouth too wide, her hands chapped from work. Plain. It was the word that had followed her all her life, a quiet, damning echo. She clutched her small valise and walked toward him, each step an act of will. The dust puffed up around the hem of her skirt. As she stopped before him, the silence between them seemed to magnify the frantic beating of her own heart. She had to speak first. She had to offer the truth of herself as a kind of bitter apology. Her voice, when it came, was a thread of sound, nearly lost in the wind that scoured the street. "Mr. Turner," she began, her gaze fixed on the worn leather of his boots, "I am Clara Dawson." She forced herself to look up, to meet those assessing eyes. I feel it is only right to say, I know I'm not pretty." The words hung in the air, a final, desperate offering of honesty. He watched her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, and she felt her hope, a small, fragile thing, begin to wither. He would send her back. Of course he would. He pushed himself off the wagon with a slow, deliberate movement. He did not smile, but the harsh lines around his eyes seemed to soften, just for a breath. "That's fine," he said, his voice a low rumble, like stones moving deep in the earth. He reached for her valise, his calloused fingers brushing hers. The touch was brief, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt through her. "I need honest, not fancy." He tossed her bag into the back of the wagon and then looked at her, truly looked, as if seeing past the plain face to the stark truth she had offered. "The world is full of fancy things that break. Come on, it's a long ride home." He offered a hand to help her up onto the wagon seat, and as her worn shoe found the step, Clara felt she was stepping not just into a wagon, but into the rest of her life, a life built on a foundation as stark and unadorned as the man beside her. The journey to his ranch was carved from silence. The wagon wheels groaned a constant complaint against the ruts of the trail, and the wind whispered through the tall, dry grasses. But between them, the quiet was a solid thing. Will Turner handled the team of horses with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. A low word, a flick of the reins, a steady pressure. He did not seem to feel the need to fill the space with talk, and for that, Clara was profoundly grateful. Words, for her, had so often been instruments of comparison and judgment. The silence of this man was a balm. She sat straight-backed on the hard wooden seat, her hands folded in her lap, and watched the country unfold. It was a landscape of brutal beauty, of vast empty spaces that promised both freedom and a terrible loneliness. The sky was an endless, aching blue, and the land beneath it rolled on, a sea of sage and dun-colored earth. It was a place that did not care for prettiness. It cared for endurance. Perhaps, she thought, she might belong here after all. She watched him, studying the set of his jaw, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. He was a part of this place. His skin tanned to the color of worn leather, his presence as solid and unassuming as the granite outcrops that broke the monotony of the plains. He was not handsome, not in the way of city men. His features were too rough-hewn, his face a map of sun and wind and hardship. But there was a rightness to him, a sense of a man who knew his own measure and asked for nothing more from the world. Hours passed. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in strokes of violent orange and soft rose. The air grew colder. Will pulled a heavy wool blanket from behind the seat and, without a word, draped it over her shoulders. The gesture was practical, not tender, yet it felt like the first kindness she had received in a very long time. The weight of the wool was comforting, a solid, tangible thing against the chill of her uncertainty. They crested a low rise, and he finally spoke, his voice startling in the twilight. "We're here." Below them, nestled in a shallow valley cut by a ribbon of a creek, was a small cabin. A curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney, a lonely signal in the immense wilderness. It was not a ranch so much as a foothold, a small, defiant claim against the vastness. A few cattle grazed near the creek, and a small barn stood sentinel beside the cabin. It was a place of profound solitude. As he guided the horses down the slope, a single lamp flickered to life in the cabin window, a tiny star of amber light in the gathering dark. It was a lonely light, she thought, for a lonely man, and now for a lonely woman. He brought the wagon to a halt and jumped down, his boots thudding on the hard-packed earth. He did not offer his hand this time. He simply waited, allowing her to descend on her own. He was giving her space, she realized, not out of coldness, but out of a kind of respect. He was letting her enter this new life on her own 2 feet. He led her inside. The cabin was one room, clean but stark, smelling of wood smoke, coffee, and soap. A cast-iron stove stood against one wall, radiating a welcome heat. A sturdy table with 2 chairs sat in the center of the room. A bed, neatly made with a patchwork quilt, occupied one corner, and a smaller cot was set up in another. This, she saw with a pang of relief, was for her. He had anticipated her need for separation, for a space of her own within his. "The well is out back," he said, gesturing with his thumb. "Privy is past the woodpile. Food is in the pantry there." He pointed to a curtained-off alcove. His tour of her new world was complete in under a minute. He offered her nothing more, no false words of welcome, no pretense of a joy he did not feel. He simply began the rituals of his evening. He stoked the fire, put a pot of coffee on to boil, and sliced thick pieces of bacon into a skillet. Clara stood uncertainly in the middle of the room, the blanket still around her shoulders, feeling like a ghost in this man's solid, solitary life. She watched as he moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency. There were no wasted steps, no hesitation. He was a man accustomed to the rhythms of self-reliance. The sizzle of the bacon filled the silence. He glanced at her. "Are you hungry?" She nodded, unable to find her voice. He gestured to the table. "Sit." She did, perching on the edge of the chair. He served the food onto 2 tin plates, bacon, beans, and a thick slice of dark bread. They ate without speaking. The food was simple, hearty, and honest, like him. After the meal, he washed the plates in a basin of hot water from the stove while she watched, feeling useless. When he was done, he turned to her. "You must be tired from the journey." It was a statement, not a question, a dismissal. He took one of the two lamps, lit it, and placed it on a small crate beside her cot. "The lamp is yours." Then he moved to his own side of the room, sat on the edge of his bed, and began to pull off his boots. He did not look at her again. He was giving her the privacy of his disregard. Clara retreated to her cot, the small circle of amber light her only sanctuary. She lay down, fully dressed, and pulled the thin blanket up to her chin. The cabin was filled with the small sounds of a man settling for the night, the thud of his boots on the floor, the rustle of clothes, the sigh of the mattress as he lay down. Soon, his breathing evened out into the slow, deep rhythm of sleep. She lay awake for a long time, listening. She listened to the sound of his breathing, to the whisper of the wind against the log walls, to the vast, unnerving silence of the Wyoming night. For the first time in her life, she was in a place where no one expected her to be anything other than what she was. She was not the plain sister, the unwanted burden, the object of pity. Here she was simply a presence, a quiet fact in a quiet room. And in that stark reality, a strange and unfamiliar feeling began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. It was not hope, not yet. It was something quieter, something sturdier. It was peace. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. Will rose before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. She would lie still, listening to him build the fire and put the coffee on, the familiar sounds becoming a strange sort of comfort. By the time she rose, he was already outside, his chores begun. He never told her what to do, never issued a single command. He left her to find her own place in his world. At first, she moved with timid caution, cleaning the cabin, mending his worn shirts with her neat, tiny stitches, preparing the simple meals. She learned the geography of his silence, the subtle shifts in his expression that meant more than a dozen words from another man. A slight narrowing of his eyes meant concern. A softening around his mouth meant a quiet satisfaction. She discovered that his home, like him, was built on a foundation of unadorned utility. Everything had a purpose. There were no trinkets, no photographs, no concessions to beauty for its own sake. The patchwork quilt on his bed, she realized, was not a decoration but a testament to thrift, made from the worn-out remnants of old shirts and trousers. Her own contributions began slowly. She found a small, neglected patch of earth behind the cabin, protected from the worst of the wind. The soil was hard and rocky, but she had patient hands. She spent hours clearing the stones, turning the soil, working in manure from the barn. Will watched her from a distance, saying nothing, but she saw the flicker of curiosity in his eyes. She had carried a small cloth bag in her valise, a treasure of seeds saved from her mother's garden back east. Hardy beans, tough-skinned squash, and a few precious tomato seeds. She planted them with a prayer, tending to the small green shoots as they emerged with a devotion that was almost fierce. This small patch of life was hers. One afternoon, she saw him limping as he led one of the horses, a sturdy mare named Bess, back to the barn. The horse was favoring her front left leg. Clara watched as Will ran a hand down the animal's leg, his brow furrowed with worry. He cleaned the hoof, found no stone, and applied a foul-smelling liniment from a jar. The next day, the swelling was worse. The mare stood with her head low, refusing to put weight on the leg. That evening, as Will sat staring into the fire, the worry etched on his face, Clara spoke. "There is a poultice my father used to use." He looked at her, his expression skeptical but not dismissive. "What's in it?" "Bran mash, mostly, and comfrey root if you have any." He grunted. "There's some that grows down by the creek. The natives call it knitbone." The next morning, he returned with a handful of the thick, hairy leaves. Clara set to work, She boiled the leaves to a soft pulp and mixed them with hot bran, creating a thick, steaming paste. She carried the bucket out to the barn where Will was watching the suffering mare. "Hold her head," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He did as she asked, his surprise evident. She approached the horse slowly, speaking in a low, soothing murmur. She slathered the warm poultice onto the swollen leg, then wrapped it securely with strips of clean cloth she'd torn from an old shift. "We leave it on until it cools," she explained. "Then do it again." For 2 days, she tended to the mare, changing the poultice 3 times a day. Will watched her, his silence now one of attentive observation. He saw the gentle confidence in her hands, the quiet authority in her voice as she calmed the animal. He saw a knowledge that was deep and practical, a skill that had nothing to do with books or fancy education. On the 3rd morning, the swelling was dramatically reduced. The mare took a tentative step, then another, putting weight on the leg. A slow look of wonder, and then profound respect, dawned on Will's face. That evening, as they sat at the table, he pushed a cup of coffee toward her. "Thank you," he said. The 2 words were heavy with unspoken meaning. "Bess is a good horse. I would have been lost without her. It was my father's knowledge, not mine." She demurred. He shook his head slowly. "Knowledge is nothing if the hands aren't steady. Your hands are steady, Clara." He said her name for the first time, and the sound of it in his low voice was a revelation. It made her feel real, solid. She was no longer just a presence in his cabin. She was Clara, and he was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. The first snow of the season came early, a fine, sifting powder that dusted the high peaks and sharpened the evening air. The nights grew longer, deeper, and the fire in the stove became the center of their small world. It was in the quiet hours after supper, with the wind howling its lonely song outside, that the walls of their silence began to crumble, stone by stone. Will had taken to carving in the evenings, shaping small animals from scraps of pine with a worn pocket knife. His hands, so strong and calloused from work, were surprisingly deft. Clara would sit nearby, mending or knitting, the click of her needles a soft counterpoint to the scrape of his knife on wood. One night, he held up a nearly finished figure, a small, elegant horse. "For you," he said, holding it out to her. "For what you did for Bess." The carving was simple but beautiful, the grain of the wood flowing like a muscle along the horse's flank. She took it, her fingers tracing its smooth lines. It was the first gift she had ever been given that was not born of duty or pity. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "My father taught me," he said, his eyes on the fire. "He was a carpenter, a good one. Made fancy things for rich people back in Ohio." The mention of his past hung in the air, an open door. Clara hesitated, then stepped through it. "My father was a farmer," she said softly. "His hands were good with the land, but nothing ever grew well enough. There were too many of us, too many daughters." She paused, the old shame a familiar ache in her chest. "My sisters were all fair, they married well. I was the last one left." Will stopped carving. He looked at her, his gaze direct and unwavering, and in his eyes she saw not pity, but a quiet understanding. "So, Kekt, is that why you answered my letter?" She nodded, unable to look at him. "I was a burden to my brother. I wanted a place to be useful." "Honest is always useful," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He set his carving aside and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I had a wife before," he said, and the words fell into the quiet room like stones into a deep well. "Her name was Eleanor." Clara held her breath. "She was the prettiest thing you ever saw. Hair like spun gold, eyes the color of a summer sky. When she walked into a room, all the light followed her." He spoke without bitterness, a simple statement of fact. She could charm a bird from a tree. Charmed me, that's for sure. I thought I had the sun and the moon. But her beauty, it was like a fancy clock with no works inside. All it did was tell you how pretty it was. He picked up a stick from the wood box and poked at the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. She hated it here. Hated the silence, the dirt, the work. Said this place was burying her alive. One day a salesman came through, selling tonics and cheap jewelry. He had slick hair and a silver tongue. A week later, they were both gone. So was the money I'd saved for 2 years to buy more cattle. He fell silent, staring into the flames as if reliving the memory. I wasn't just angry, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I was ashamed that I'd been so blind. I'd spent my whole life valuing things that were solid, things that worked, and I'd let myself be fooled by something that was just fancy. He finally looked at her, his pale eyes searching her face. When I wrote that advertisement, I swore I'd never make that mistake again. I didn't ask for a pretty wife. I asked for an honest one. Clara felt a knot in her chest loosen, a painful, constricting band that had been there for as long as she could remember. He had not chosen her in spite of her plainness. He had chosen her because of it. Her greatest shame was, to him, her greatest virtue. She reached out, a small, hesitant gesture, and laid her hand on his arm. His muscles were hard as rock beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. He did not pull away. He simply sat there, allowing her touch, a silent acknowledgement of the shared vulnerability that now bound them more tightly than any vow. The trip to Laramie for winter supplies was a necessity they could no longer postpone. The snows were coming in earnest, and they needed flour, salt, coffee, and other goods to see them through the long, isolated months ahead. For Clara, the thought of returning to the town, of facing the eyes of strangers, was a source of quiet dread. The cabin had become her world, a safe harbor where her worth was measured in steady hands and quiet competence. The world outside was a different country, one that judged by other, harsher standards. As they rode into town, the wagon rattling over the frozen ruts, she felt the old anxieties stir. People did stare. She saw women on the boardwalk pause their conversations, their gazes lingering on her, then flicking to Will with a kind of pitying curiosity. She knew what they were thinking. They were remembering Eleanor, the beautiful, faithless wife. They were comparing this plain, quiet woman to that golden memory and finding her wanting. Will seemed oblivious, his face set in its usual stoic lines, but Clara felt the weight of every glance like a physical blow. Inside the general store, the air was thick with the smells of leather, spices, and chewing tobacco. As Will gave his list to the proprietor, Mr. Abernathy, a woman with a face like a dried apple and eyes as sharp as needles approached Clara. "You must be the new Mrs. Turner," she said, her voice carrying a false sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Martha Gable. My. We'll certainly chose differently this time." The woman's smile was a thin, cruel line. Before Clara could stammer a reply, a man standing by the counter, a burly rancher with a florid face, laughed loudly. "That's one word for it, Martha. Heard you traded a songbird for a field hen, Turner." Will turned slowly. He finished his transaction with Mr. Abernathy, carefully counting his change. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at the man who had insulted his wife. He simply walked over to where Clara stood, frozen with humiliation. He placed his large, warm hand on the small of her back, a gesture that was both protective and possessive. Then he looked at the rancher, his pale eyes as cold and hard as river ice. "My wife's name is Clara Henderson," he said, his voice low and even, yet it cut through the murmuring in the store like a razor. "She can heal a horse you'd shoot. She can grow a garden on rock. She's worth 10 of the woman you remember." He paused, letting the words sink in. Keep her name out of your mouth. The rancher's face paled, and he suddenly found something fascinating to study on the floorboards. The silence in the store was absolute. Will guided Clara toward the door, his hand never leaving her back. He loaded their supplies into the wagon with a grim efficiency, and they began the long ride home. The silence in the wagon was different this time. It was not comfortable. It was charged with her shame and his anger. She stared at her hands, twisted in the lap of her brown dress, feeling the sting of tears behind her eyes. He had defended her, and it had only made her feel more like a burden, a plain brown problem he was forced to solve. He had called her his wife, and the word felt like a lie. They returned to the cabin as dusk was settling, the silence between them heavy and unbroken. While Will put the horses away, Clara unpacked the supplies, her movements stiff and jerky. The humiliation from the store clung to her like trail dust. She had brought shame on him. The town saw her as a poor replacement, a testament to his foolishness. The small measure of peace she had found in this isolated valley felt shattered. When he came inside, stamping the cold from his boots, she could not bring herself to look at him. She busied herself at the stove, her back to him, pretending an urgent need to stir a pot of stew that was not yet even simmering. He came and stood behind her, his presence a large, warm weight in the small room. Clara. She flinched at the sound of her name, at the gentleness in his tone. She did not want his pity. Don't, she whispered, her voice choked. You don't have to say anything. I know what they think. What you must think. I know what I think, he said, his voice firm. And it's not what Henderson thinks. He was quiet for a moment. There's something in the barn I want to show you. She followed him numbly, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the biting wind. Inside the barn, the air smelled of hay and animals. He lit a lantern, the golden light pushing back the shadows. In a corner, covered by a dusty canvas, was a small trunk. He knelt and opened it. It was Eleanor's. Inside were silk dresses in jewel tones, delicate shoes with ridiculously high heels, and bottles of French perfume. And on the very top, a small silver-backed hand mirror, its surface tarnished, its frame intricately carved with useless, fancy roses. He picked it up and held it out to her. Clara stared at it, then at her own reflection in its clouded surface. She saw her plain, tired face, her frightened eyes. This was the mirror that had reflected a beauty so dazzling it had blinded a good man. And now it reflected her. The tears she had been holding back finally fell, silent tracks on her dusty cheeks. This is what they see, she whispered. This is what you lost. Will took the mirror from her trembling hand. He looked at it for a long moment, then set it down on a workbench. He picked up a piece of scrap leather, the same kind he used to mend harnesses, thick, sturdy, and unadorned. With his pocket knife, he began to work. He did not speak. The only sounds were the scrape of the blade and Clara's quiet sobs. He pried the silver frame off the mirror, tossing the flimsy, tarnished metal into a dusty corner. Then, with patient, deliberate movements, he began to craft a new frame from the honest leather. He cut it to size, stitched the corners with strong waxed thread, and worked the leather with his thumbs until it was smooth and fit perfectly around the glass. He polished the glass with his sleeve until it shone. He held it out to her again. The simple, sturdy leather frame transformed the object. It was no longer a symbol of vanity and deceit. It was a tool. It was honest. The glass is good, he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. It just tells the truth. It was the frame that was the lie. Clara took the mirror. She looked at her reflection again. She saw the same plain face, the same wide mouth, the same sad eyes. But this time, framed in honest leather, held in the steady hands of a good man, she saw something else too. She saw strength. She saw endurance. She saw a woman who had survived. She saw a woman Will Turner had chosen. The mirror became a silent testament, sitting on the small crate beside her cot. Each morning, it reflected a face that seemed a little less tired, a little less afraid. The act of reframing it had reframed something inside her as well. The quiet between them changed again, deepening into a shared intimacy that no longer needed to be broken. They were partners, their lives woven together by the threads of daily routine and mutual respect. The physical space between them, the few feet that separated her cot from his bed, began to feel less like a boundary and more like a bridge waiting to be crossed. One evening, a fierce blizzard descended upon the valley, erasing the world in a churning vortex of white. The wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin, and the snow piled in deep drifts against the door. They were sealed in, a tiny island of warmth and light in a frozen sea. The storm raged for 2 days, and in that forced proximity, something shifted. They talked more than they ever had, sharing stories of their childhoods, small, simple memories that painted the empty spaces of their pasts. He told her about a dog he'd had as a boy, a scruffy mutt named Jack. She told him about the one time she'd won a prize at the county fair for her strawberry preserves. They were small, ordinary truths, but they felt like sacred offerings in the storm-lashed quiet. On the second night of the blizzard, the fire was burning low. Will rose to add another log to the stove, and as he stood there, silhouetted against the orange glow, he seemed to Clara the strongest, most decent man she had ever known. He had built this life with his own 2 hands, had suffered a deep betrayal, and had emerged not bitter, but with a profound understanding of what was real and what was not. He had seen the truth of her, and had not turned away. When he sat back down at the table, she did something she would never have dared to do before. She reached across the worn wood and laid her hand over his. His hand was large, calloused, and wonderfully warm. He stopped, his gaze dropping to their joined hands, and then he looked up at her. His pale eyes held a question. She did not answer with words. She simply tightened her grip, a silent affirmation. This was not a gesture of need or of gratitude. It was a gesture of choice. She was choosing him, just as he had chosen her. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. His touch was gentle, almost tentative, as if he were holding something precious and fragile. They sat like that for a long time. The only sound the roar of the wind and the crackle of the fire. The storm outside was a raging beast, but inside the small cabin, a profound and holy calm had settled. Later, as the fire died to embers, he did not move toward his bed, nor she to her cot. He stood and held out his hand to her. She took it and allowed him to lead her to his side of the room, to the bed with the patchwork quilt made of honest, worn-out things. There was no passion in the modern sense, no tempest of desire. It was something deeper, quieter. It was a union of 2 solitudes, a solemn, reverent coming together. In the dim light, he touched her face, his rough fingertips tracing the line of her jaw. "Clara," he whispered, and her name was a prayer. In that moment, she finally understood that he was not settling for her. He was not choosing the lesser of 2 evils. He was choosing her, all of her, with a clarity and purpose that humbled her. And as he drew her close, she knew she was finally, truly home. Spring arrived as it always did in the high country, with a fierce, reluctant beauty. The snows melted, swelling the creek to a rushing torrent, and patches of impossible green appeared on the valley floor. The world felt new, washed clean. Clara, too, felt new. A quiet joy had taken root inside her, a feeling so unfamiliar she was almost afraid to name it. She was Will's wife in every sense of the word, and in his arms she had found not just safety, but a deep and abiding tenderness. The cot in the corner was dismantled and stored in the barn. Their lives were now fully entwined. One bright afternoon in late May, as she was tending her burgeoning garden, she saw a rider approaching. It was not a sight they were used to. Visitors were rare to the point of being non-existent. As the rider drew closer, a cold dread coiled in Clara's stomach. It was a woman, perched on a fine-looking horse with an expensive saddle. She was dressed in a traveling suit of deep blue velvet, a color too rich for this landscape. And as she drew off her riding gloves, Clara saw a face of such perfect, heartbreaking beauty that it could only belong to one person: Eleanor. She dismounted with a fluid grace, her golden hair gleaming in the sun. She ignored Clara completely, her eyes fixed on the cabin, on Will, who had just emerged, his face a mask of disbelief and thunderous anger. "Will," Eleanor said, her voice a melody of practiced sorrow. "I've come back." Will did not move. "You're not welcome here." "Please, darling," she said, taking a step toward him, her hand outstretched. "He left me. The scoundrel took everything and abandoned me in Cheyenne. I have nowhere else to go. I was a fool, I know that now. This is my home. You are my husband." Her eyes, the color of a summer sky, filled with tears, but they did not spill over. "I see you found yourself some help." She finally deigned to look at Clara, her gaze sweeping over Clara's simple dress and dirt-stained hands with unconcealed contempt. "Hello," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You must be the hired girl." "She's my wife," Will said, the words like chips of ice. He moved to stand beside Clara, placing a solid arm around her shoulders. The gesture was a declaration, a wall he was building around her. Eleanor's perfect face hardened. "Your wife? Don't be ridiculous, Will. You can't possibly love that. Look at her. She's as plain as a mud fence. You had me. You know what it is to have a beautiful woman in your bed. You can't be happy with this." She turned her full attention to Clara. "He's lying to you, you poor thing. He's just using you to keep the house warm. He'll grow tired of looking at your dreary face and send you packing. He'll come back to me. They always do." The venom in her words was meant to poison the fragile confidence Clara had so recently found. But looking at Will's stony face, feeling the steady strength of his arm around her, Clara felt not fear, but a surge of protective fury. This woman would not destroy the life they had built. She would not take this good man and break him again. "You should go," Clara said, her voice quiet but shaking with intensity. Eleanor laughed, a high, brittle sound. "Or what? You'll throw a potato at me?" In a flash of desperate rage, Eleanor lunged forward, not at Clara, but at the lantern hanging by the barn door. She smashed it against the dry wood, and oil and flame exploded outwards. A sheet of fire roared up the side of the barn. The horses inside screamed in terror. Will shoved Clara out of the way and ran for the barn doors, intent on saving the animals. As he fought with the heavy doors, a burning beam cracked and fell, striking him across the shoulder. He collapsed to the ground. Eleanor stood watching, her face a mask of horrified triumph. But Clara did not hesitate. The quiet woman, the plain woman, moved with a speed she did not know she possessed. She grabbed a heavy horse blanket from a fence rail, plunged it into the water trough, and ran into the inferno. She threw the soaking blanket over Will, shielding him from the worst of the flames, and with a strength born of love and desperation, she began to drag him, inch by agonizing inch, away from the collapsing, roaring barn and toward the safety of the creek. She got him to the water's edge, his body a dead weight, his face pale and smeared with soot. The back of his shirt was scorched, and an angry red burn was visible on his shoulder and back. He was unconscious. Above them, the barn was a funeral pyre, the greedy flames consuming the structure, that had been a cornerstone of their life. Eleanor was gone, having fled on her fine horse at the sight of the destruction she had wrought. Clara was alone with her husband and the ruins. Panic clawed at her throat, but she forced it down. Will's life depended on her. Her steady hands, the ones he had praised, could not fail him now. She tore strips from her petticoat and soaked them in the cold creek water, gently laying them over his burns. She cradled his head in her lap, murmuring his name, begging him to wake up. His eyelids fluttered. "Clara?" he rasped, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "The horses, they got out." She lied, her voice thick with tears. "They're safe. Everything is safe." She knew it was a lie. The barn was gone, and with it, much of their winter hay and tack. But he was alive. That was the only truth that mattered. For the next week, she became his keeper. She half carried, half dragged him back to the cabin. She cleaned and dressed his burns with the knowledge passed down from her father, using cool compresses of crushed plantain leaves to draw out the heat and pain. She brewed willow bark tea for his fever. She spoon-fed him broth, coaxed water between his cracked lips, and sat by his bed through the long nights, listening to his pained, shallow breathing. In those grueling days, their roles were utterly reversed. He was helpless, and she was his sole protector, his provider, his healer. She did the chores he could not, milking their one cow, tending her garden, securing what little was left. She worked until her muscles screamed and her body ached with a weariness so profound it felt like it had settled in her bones. Yet she never faltered. Each time she looked at his face, peaceful in a fevered sleep, she found a new reserve of strength. This was love, she realized. Not a poetic fancy, but this grit, this relentless choosing of another's well-being over your own comfort, your own exhaustion, your own fear. One afternoon, he woke, his fever broken. The clarity had returned to his pale eyes. He watched her as she moved about the cabin, her face smudged with dirt, her hair falling from its pins. "The barn is gone," he stated, his voice weak but clear. She stopped and turned to him. "Yes." "And the horses?" She couldn't lie to him now. Bess got out. The other, he was trapped. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the soot on his cheek. "She did this." "Yes," Clara said. "She's gone." He was silent for a long time. "We've lost everything." "No," she said, coming to sit on the edge of the bed. She took his hand, the one that wasn't burned. "We haven't. We have the cabin. We have the cow. The garden is doing well, and we have each other." He looked at her then, truly looked at her. He saw not the plain woman he had married, but the fierce, capable woman who had pulled him from a fire, who had tended his wounds, who had held their world together with her two steady hands. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we can't stay here. The smoke, it'll draw attention, and she might come back." "Then we'll leave," she said simply, without a trace of fear. "We'll find another valley. We'll build another barn." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her chapped knuckles. "I chose you because I needed honest," he whispered. "I didn't know I was getting the strongest woman in the whole damn territory." Her plain face, framed by the soft cabin light, was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. They left a month later, when Will was strong enough to travel. They packed what little they had into the sturdy wagon, their clothes, the patchwork quilt, a few pots and pans, and Clara's precious mirror with its honest leather frame. They left the cabin standing, a silent monument to a life that had been burned away, but not destroyed. They turned the wagon west, toward the jagged peaks of the mountains, seeking a place so remote that the ghosts of the past could not find them. The journey was slow, arduous. But this time, the silence was one of complete communion. They were a single unit, moving toward a shared future. They found their place in the high country, a hidden valley cradled by pine-covered slopes, with a meadow of green grass and a creek that ran clear and cold. It was a place of deep peace, a place to begin again. They built their new home with their own hands. It was smaller than the first, just a single snug room built of logs they felled and stripped themselves. Will, with his father's carpentry skills, built a sturdy bed, a solid table, and 2 chairs. Clara planted a new garden, and the seeds, carried from so far away, took root in the rich mountain soil. As summer faded into a golden autumn and the aspens on the hillsides turned to flame, Clara knew she was with child. She told Will one evening as they sat before their new hearth. He didn't speak. He simply came to her, knelt before her, and laid his head in her lap, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. His shoulders shook with a quiet, joyful emotion that needed no words. Life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. The seasons turned. The snows came, blanketing their hidden valley in a profound and welcome silence. They were entirely alone and entirely content. One afternoon, the following spring, Will came in from checking his new fence line. Clara was sitting in a rocking chair he had made for her, humming a quiet tune as she stitched a tiny gown from a soft piece of flannel. Her belly was round and full beneath her apron. The cabin was filled with the smell of baking bread. He stopped in the doorway, watching her. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating her face, lighting the soft brown of her hair. He looked at her, at this woman who had been sent to him as a plain, practical solution to a lonely life. He saw the gentle curve of her cheek, the quiet strength in her eyes, the peaceful set of her mouth. He had once told her he needed honest, not fancy. He had believed it was a choice, a trade-off. He had been wrong. In the steadfast, loving, and fiercely capable soul of his wife, he had found that the truest things were also the most beautiful. The plain face he had first seen at the Laramie train station had become the landscape of his entire world, a geography of courage and grace. He crossed the room and knelt before her, placing his hand over hers on the swell of her belly. The baby kicked, a tiny, insistent flutter of new life. She looked up at him and smiled, and in her smile was the promise of every good thing he had ever hoped for. "I love you, Clara," he said, the words as simple and solid as the log walls around them. She leaned forward and kissed him, a soft, lingering kiss that tasted of bread and wood smoke and home. "I know," she whispered. Out here, on the edge of the world, in a life they had built from ashes and honesty, they had found what all the fancy, beautiful things in the world could never provide, a place to be truly, completely, and finally known.